broke setup. They do have sheep though, and they do have wool that they can make rugs out of. Since they're nomads, they don't often have enough time in the old days to live in one place and make real rugs that are knotted rugs. So you see in Kyrgyz textiles, we'll take just a second to talk about, are almost always felt. And so this is something called a shurdak, which is a sewn together felt rug that they put in the floors of their yurts. And you'll see that there is a twin to this, which is red on the outside and brown on the inside, because this is the way it was cut, sort of a shadow of itself, like that. And so these are the fancy things that people make for themselves. But then they have some unfancy stuff, which is much more simple, which is just different colored wool that is rolled into felt. And to get the designs on it, you just take some soft wool of a different color and put it on this mattress of thick hair before you decide to go ahead and roll it and turn it into felt. And that's that. But they do all sorts of other things. Here, for example, on this pile of carpets is a very interesting rug that's made out of dyed sheepskin. That basically is just pieces of sheepskin that have been put together. This is probably 1920 or 1915. And it's kind of a sleeping carpet that they used to keep warm, stuff like that. The saddles that they used in these horses of theirs were usually much more, and how would you describe this as a type of saddle?
Hard.
Nasty, I know, but besides that. Anyway, it is what you think of very much more as a medieval style saddle. There's no pommel or anything on it like that. The horses are a lot smaller than ours, but they're not like Mongolian ponies. But you'd have some pads to put this on, and I'll pass this around. This is probably about turn of the century saddle, like that.
It's heavy.
Yeah, it
What's
is.
it made of?
Wood. And then metal.
It looks like metal.
Well, yeah, but it's wood inside.
Oh, that
like
poor
that.
horse.
Yeah, that's
Then he
right.
puts a person on top of that.
Well, that's
Oh,
right.
yeah.
And,
We got really thick pads.
yeah, very good pads. And we have some
Distribute the weight.
upstairs.
I bet the horses were sway back, weren't they?
Well, not too much, but, anyway, the interesting thing about all of this is they, of course, eat a lot of horse meat as well. And we're having, and some of you have maybe heard this story, so I'll make it short, but there was a time when I was in a yurt in the middle of nowhere in Kyrgyzstan, and the guy had been very kind and had given us food, and he was explaining that this was the last of his horse sausage that we were eating, so he was going to have to make, have to butcher another horse to make more sausage. And like a silly foreigner, I'm sitting there in the yurt looking out the window. His family with the kids were there, and I'm looking out, and there's a whole bunch of horses on the outside on the door, outside the door. And I sort of said, "Oh, so you mean you're going to butcher that one?" And I pointed to one outside. It didn't have any tack on it or anything like this. It was just sort of tied to the fence. And his 12-year-old daughter started to cry. Oh. And her husband and her mom was, we're speaking Russian, and her mom and her dad were both horrified. And the dad said, "Oh no, not that horse. That's a riding horse, not an eating horse." Because it's just like 4-H, right? I mean, if you're going to grow something to eat it, you're not going to become its best friend. So here in these cultures, they have riding horses and eating horses, and they don't mix them, and you don't get to be friends with the one you're going to eat. What is interesting about this as we get into talking about the games and the different horses that are horse sports that we're going to see, is that I had never thought about this before I went to these games, but the question of if you're an American team, we're gonna see American teams in these games. Do you bring your horses with you from Wyoming? You know, and the answer is no, you don't. Most of these things, even we were in Uzbekistan and there was a national or an international show jumping competition for the International Equestrian, blah, blah, blah. And even them, they didn't bring their horses with them. There was pools of horses that they actually do a lottery
For Michael, she found her husband.
to pick the horse that you're going to use for this sport. And so what you do is, you know, we as somebody watching these games are going to show up the day that the sport is going on. But the teams that are there showed up a week or two before. And they have done a lottery and picked out of a hat number 44. And so in the case of this strange rugby on horseback with the dead goat that we're going to talk about, Kookaburra, the pool of about 100 horses are all trained Kookaburra horses that have played the sport, which is a very physical sport of bashing into each other and things like that. And so the foreign teams that don't have their horses with them will get a lottery number and they'll go and make friends with this horse and have about a week to get to know it and get to figure out how to ride it and things like that. And the guys that I was talking to, the Americans on this team, have said their main problem is that in America, when you're riding, and Ella is our horsewoman here, so basically you're commanding it with your body, you know, with movements with your knees and your stirrups and things like that. In Central Asia, they're all commanded with voice commands. So there is about a 40-word vocabulary for a Kookaburra horse on stop, go left, go faster, block, throw a pick, you know, block the goal and things like that. And a couple of the Americans that I was chatting with said this is the hardest thing for them because in the heat of this game, they tend to revert back to getting the horse to try to go where they want it to go. And the amount of Americans and non-Central Asians falling off their horses all the time are a large part due to the fact that they've lost the communications because they may have known the Kyrgyz word for stop and go left, but when they go, you know, and they're pulling to the right, it gets all confused, and luckily the whole game is played under a soft sand, so you don't get very badly hurt when you fall off.
What are the saddles like? Are they Western saddles?
No, they're not, and you'll see some of those. Okay. They're basically wooden saddles covered with leather, and they are special Kookaburra saddles, which are fairly low backs, so because you're lifting your leg and climbing over a lot, and you don't want to have to lift it any higher than you have to. In any event, this whole horse culture is really fascinating to those of us that you know, like horses and know a little bit about it down here. The one sport that we are not going to see, and it was interesting because I could never get a straight answer about why this wasn't actually one of the sports in these Nomad games. The national sport of Kyrgyzstan is a sport which is called Kizkumai. And what you see on this t-shirt is a guy chasing a girl on a horse. And then what you see on this Soviet era copper art piece is a girl chasing a guy on a horse. And these are basically the two elements of the national game of Kyrgyzstan, Kizkumai, which is something that is practiced and has been competition between clans, between villages, between collective farms for hundreds of years, apparently. And what it involves is a guy, and you'll see we actually do have that one short video of the girl trick riding.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to show that in a second. But basically, what happens is each village or entity has a guy and a girl, their best riders. And the idea is that this game is played by having a girl take off across the field on her horse at the sound of a gun or a whistle. And then, like 5 or 10 seconds later, depending on how big the field is, another gun or whistle goes off, and a guy takes off after her on his horse. And the idea is he is supposed to ride faster than her and get up. And if he catches her, he gets to give her a kiss. Now, by the time that the next gun fires, if he hasn't caught her, then the tables are turned. She reels her horse around and chases him back to the starting line, beating him with her riding crop. Okay, and and so what you have in the T-shirt is the girl riding, looking back at the guy, and this old-fashioned thing, which is the more fun part, is when the guy hasn't caught the girl, and the tables are turned, she chases him back to the starting point with everybody cheering on her side as she's whacking him with her riding crop. And I talked to people that play the game, and they had a demonstration of this at this ethnic village that we'll see in a couple of videos. But what had happened was that they didn't want to have a violent sport. This is what the best thing I could hear from somebody, one of the organizers. And it's a uniquely Kyrgyz sport, so they had a demonstration of it, sort of, but they weren't doing competitions for it. And what is interesting in talking to people that play it is that there's actually quite a lot of strategy involved, if you think about it, because if you're the guy, you want to get after the girl. Everybody's betting on it. Each village is, bragging rights and things like this. You want to get after her and catch her as quick as you can, get your kiss, and then you win. If you see that you are not going to catch her, you got to look like you're riding really hard, but you look like you're riding hard and you slow down a little bit because you want to be as far as you can respectfully be from her when the next gun goes off, so that when she wheels around, you're far enough ahead that she's not going to be able to beat you with her riding crop all the way back. And if you're the girl and you're riding, you don't want to get caught. You want to stay far enough ahead of him that he doesn't catch you. But you also want to stay close enough to him so that when the gun goes off, you can wheel around and beat him, all the way back to the beginning. And so it's really quite an interesting game. And everybody bets huge amounts of money and liquor on it.
So what does it mean to catch the girl? Does he actually have to pull her off the horse?
Nope. All he has to do is basically get up, grab her reins, and reach over, and we'll see on a video. It's sort of a peck on the cheek kind of thing, but it's the bragging rights of winning. And what's interesting is it developed out of a whole culture that you may or may have read about in the past, about how nomads in this whole area figured out eons ago that you've got to be real careful about how you manage the gene pool in your family and your clan, because everybody figured out pretty quickly that you can't be marrying your cousin, certainly not your sister, and there was these annual encampments that all these tribes would come together for hundreds of years back, and they would play horse games like we're going to see and things like that. And of course, young people they didn't have discos in those days, but they'd go out and meet each other and things like that. And one of the byproducts of these summer encampments was for young people to meet each other, so that you could spread out the gene pool a bit and make sure that you've got as healthy a population of people as you could get. The issues, though, in terms of traditions have always been, and there was an article, I think, in the Financial Times just a couple weeks ago, and that they're still griping about this in Kyrgyzstan, because there is a tradition in Mongolia and Central Asia of basically stealing your wife. So what you do is you sneak off to another family's encampment and basically kidnap a girl and she becomes your wife. Now, the question is, was this ever truly a kidnapping? Because a lot of these people had met during these summer encampments. And so what happened? Hi, guys. There's a
Hi.
couple more chairs down
Oh,
here if
good.
you want to sit down. So this was the tradition, but if you were right over there, if you were the men in the family and this other guy and his brother came and stole your sister, you had to at least pretend to chase after him and get her back, because this would bring dishonor to the family. And so this was part of the tradition of chasing after the people that had just stolen your sister, whether she was stolen willingly, which is probably the case, or not. And for hundreds of years of this tradition, the people chasing after the departing sister and the groom, you know, would shout and wave their swords and maybe shoot a few arrows at them. And it didn't really make much difference, and everybody sort of felt honor is appeased, and then they'd start a family and it would go on and it'd be just fine. Unfortunately, about the end of the 18th century, when the Cossacks and the Russians came in and took over Siberia and then started to go down into Central Asia, they brought firearms. So now, when you went chasing after your sister and the guy that's stealing her, you actually had a gun, and you could actually cause some damage. And apparently in about 1850, there was a big summer conference where all of the leaders of these clans got together and said, we got to do something about this, because these guns are getting more and more accurate, and now, you know, there was 10 cases of somebody being hurt, getting shot. Sometimes the girl got shot, you know, sometimes the groom got shot. So they agreed that they would all stop that practice, and they would instead have a game. And the game became this kiskumai, which was a chance for the guy to chase the girl, and then if the guy didn't catch the girl could beat him with a riding crop all the way back.
Let me ask you, did they really, were they just making fun with the beating, or did they really beat them and hurt them?
Well, I don't think they hurt him. The idea is the embarrassment of it.
She really loved it, didn't she?
Well, yeah, and so it's, you know, the question of how hard the beating is when you're riding a horse at full gallop, leaning forward and trying to get this guy, you know, it's more the embarrassment and the humiliation of getting beaten. There is, you know, there is a scene in, we are interested in the marriage customs of all these places we go, and there happens to be in Kyrgyz weddings still, there is a time in the ceremony where, because there's still a horse culture, the father of the bride gives the groom a riding crop. And he says in Kyrgyz, up until today, it has been my job to discipline this girl. From today, it's your job to discipline this woman. Now, that always gets horrendous laughs in the group that's assembled, because everybody knows that in a Kyrgyz family, the person that wields the riding crop is the woman, not the man, you know. But it's still this tradition of passing this on, and whenever that's said, I've heard it on almost every wedding that I've gone to, a half a dozen weddings, there's these guffaws and these chortles as soon as they say that, because they know who's going to really be using that riding crop, you know, and it ain't the guy, things like that. So anyway, so they have a lot of very interesting customs that they've gone along with, and the idea was back in about 2012, the Kyrgyz started to think, well, you know, we've got to encourage tourism. We want to encourage holding on to the traditions of nomadism, which is our culture. There happens to be all these other countries around, the different stands, Mongolia, different parts of the Russian Federation that are traditionally nomad cultures. And there had always been little efforts at trying to get together to do sort of nomadic kinds of games. And so in Kyrgyzstan, in 2014, they had the first World Nomad Games. And it was a small effort with like maybe several hundred athletes from about 10 or 15 different countries. They came together and they played a bunch of sports, had a good time, and they did it as a venue down around this lake, which is this sort of tourist lake that's been there for so long. And then each time they did it every 2 years, it got better and bigger and bigger. And the big deal in 2016 at the second one was Steven Seagal was there. And some of you are old enough to remember Steven Seagal, but anyway.
He's made years ago.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So he was the big star then. Well, this year, which is the third one, this thing has really grown to be, if you think of Eurovision as the biggest music festival in the world that no Americans have ever heard of, you know, even though we know ABBA came from somewhere and things like that. Well, this World Nomad Games is like the biggest sporting event in the world that nobody in America has ever heard of. Except some Americans have, because we were surprised to find American teams there. And we'll hear a couple of them on a couple of these videos. And so this year, there was like 3,000 athletes there. They were from 82 different countries. And they had a total of 37 different sports. There was about 5 or 6 different American teams there in different sports. It was interesting because anybody that wanted to sign up for one of these sports could sign up. So there was no sort of pre-qualification or any kind of world roster of how good you're doing on this sport to be able to play like in the Olympics or something like this. So these 82 countries who all had a chance and the talent nights to show off by doing folk dancing and their costumes. There were 3 African, Togo, Ivory Coast, and Botswana were there. You know, not traditional nomad cultures unless you think that we were all nomads at one time, you know. There is a very strange game in which is a little bit like lawn bowls or bowl perhaps, in which you throw bones at some bones in a circle, trying to knock them off where they are. And the Czech Republic sent a team, or had a team of guys that went there, and they were trying to figure out before they went what sport they were going to sign up for, because none of them could ride a horse. They weren't wrestlers, they weren't archers, but they were reading about all these different sports. And I've got some, I'll pass these around there somewhere.
There's some things here.
There's a whole bunch of stuff here that will talk about all of these different sports there were. And so they decided to put together a team to play this silly little bone game that I only saw once from very far away and didn't look very exciting, as a matter of fact. But the sports, and then we're going to go and talk and show some of the pictures that I took. It was fascinating because they are the tossing of the bones to knock the cow bone out of the circle is called ordu. And so there was that sport, which is a Kyrgyz sport. There was 6 different horse races, ranging from long distance horse races of 2 kinds. One was 20-kilometer race, and another one was an 85-kilometer race. You know, so traditionally the Kyrgyz used to have a 24-hour horse race. I don't know how many kilometers that would have been, but now they're sort of making it a little more controllable. So there was, these 6 different kinds of horse races. Then there is about 12 different kinds of wrestling. And so there was this great traditional nomad wrestling type called sumo.
I love that.
There were sumo wrestlers there, you know, so the Japan, you know, so the fact is, this was one of the most inclusive sporting events you could ever imagine. Because, you know, you want to do a sport, just talk to the organizers, and obviously the Japanese wanted to do sumo. So there was sumo racing,
Did
you
the
know.
audience ever come up the way they do in Mongolia? Did the audience ever come up and try to challenge one of those wrestlers?
No, this was pretty carefully controlled
Yeah, okay.
with security and things like this. But, and then there's Er Inish, which is the horseback wrestling, and I think we have on one of the videos.
I think there's some pictures of it.
Yeah. Anyway, what you basically are trying to pull somebody off their horse, and everybody's cheering and things like that. There is all sorts of different kinds of wrestling with a kind of martial arts with a belt and trying to grab and pull somebody out of a ring. From Azerbaijan, from Russia, you know, from Argentina. I mean, you thought, what's that all about? And so there was just this hilarious number of kinds of wrestling. There's one called mat wrestling, which is a Kazakh wrestling, which you basically are got a stick, and you're trying to pull somebody over a little board barrier, and you're pulling like that. There's arm wrestling, and at least about half of these wrestling things, not the sumo, there was both men and women's wrestling. So there was a lot of women participation in women's sports and all of these things. There was women participating in all the horse racing. The one thing that women weren't participating in yet was the Kok Baru, which is the traditional rugby on horseback with the dead goat, which is really the thing that everybody comes to see and is the most popular sport in this thing. So it was fascinating to see this. There was like something, different amounts from 15 to 20,000 people came to watch this. We'll see some pictures of this ethnic village way up in the mountains with about 500 or 600 yurts where a lot of the eagle hunting. So you had golden eagle hunting, you had various kind of raptors, you had falcon hunting, you had hawk hunting, you had dog racing. Interestingly enough, there was a number of teams from United Arab Emirates, from Oman, from Saudi Arabia, and they did pretty well on the dog racing. They won a number of medals in the dog racing and things like that.
So
But
where
there-
did the people stay who attended?
There was hotels all around this lake and things like this, and so the participants stayed in some of the hotels. We stayed in, there was all these old interest hotels from the Soviet days, but now there's all these new fancy resorts, so that with condos that rich Russians.
Is it expensive? Did you say?
Some of them could be, yeah. I mean, there's everything from $25 a day to $250
Is
a
it
day.
swimming that lake? I mean, is it nice
Oh,
water?
yeah,
to
oh, it's
swim?
nice water,
I mean,
yeah.
I mean to say it's warm enough to swim in.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
Cold.
Well, but I swam.
Well, I couldn't say.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so what I thought we would do is we would walk through some of the photos that we took, and we'll talk a little bit about getting down there. And so we're gonna put Dave to work here, or Dave Bennett again, those of you who know him.
Can I ask you,
Yeah.
what did